Psychoanalysis in Indian tradition. We have started off with Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. In the first two sessions, we saw an outline of the book Yoga Sutras. And in this session, we will start off with the Yoga Sutras themselves, the aphorisms themselves. So what I plan to do is take up 10 aphorisms in every session. It will take us about 20 sessions to complete Yoga Sutras. If time is not there, I'll try to do 20 sutras in one session to shorten it out. Let us see how it goes. Sutra 1. So this is the way Patanjali has written down. Sutra 1, 1.2. I mean, of course, he has written down in Sanskrit. We put up in English. So this is the original Sanskrit Sutra written down by Patanjali. This is the English translation that I have done. Not that I am very good in translation. I have taken help from others who have also done translation slightly differently. I would request you to go to the Sanskrit channel, and there is one book by, I think, the Shivanand Society, or I'm not very sure, but Shivanand Society, I think. They also have got a translation. Some other good translations also exist. So this is the Sanskrit aphorism given by sage Patanjali. This is the English translation. Don't go by the exactness of this. I have not done it from a verbatim, literal, exact translation approach. I have done more from a meaning point of view. So you will find different translations of the same Sanskrit thing. Whatever you feel is more appealing, you can take it up. We will discuss this statement in the light of what I understand and in the light of psychoanalysis. So we don't really have to get into the Sanskrit words, the etymology of the words, how this word has been created by combining two words, or separate them, look at the etymology of each. That will become a different course of discourse. So what I will do is I will focus on this English translation and do a discussion of this English translation. So let's start with it. Sutra 1.1 says Atha Yoga Anushasanam. You don't have to know it. Translated in English, it simply means now the discipline of yoga. And this is like an entry into yoga, which talks about that it's a discipline. And the discipline is given by voluntarily by the person to himself. It cannot be forced. So this is an opening statement where he opens up the discussion by saying, now we'll get into the discipline of yoga. And the second sutra is very important. So when we say discipline, It is not discipline in the military sense where it is imposed. Rather, it is the discipline of the type that we see in psychoanalysis in terms of the do's and don'ts, the frame as we define it. Sutra 1.2 really starts the discussion, and he says, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Translated, it means yoga is cessation of all psychic activities. And this is where we can start our discussion. What he is referring to yoga here is not the process of yoga, rather the goal of yoga. So he is using the word yoga as a synonym of the word enlightenment. So yoga means union of oneself with that enlightening silence inside is what is referred to by the word yoga. So the word yoga can mean physical exercises, hatha yoga, breathing exercises, pranayam. It can mean working on the chakras. But here, what he means is, he is using the word yoga as a synonym of the word samadhi or the word enlightenment. And the goal of yoga is union. And he is using word yoga in that sense. And what he says is, it is a cessation of all psychic activities. This is where we get again into discussion with, from a psychological standpoint, that this brings out what we discussed in session 1 in this series, that there is a paradigmatic difference between the Eastern thought, especially Indian spirituality or Hindu spirituality, and psychoanalysis or Western thought in general. Sage Patanjali talks here about the goal, that the goal is the state of enlightenment or samadhi, and that goal is defined as cessation of all psychological activities. And obviously by psychological activities, he means all the conscious activities. The unconscious activities related to the preservation of the body have to still go on. So the cessation is of the conscious activities. The conscious psychic activities, this is, you enter into a state of no thought, no effect. This is where the first difference comes up. Psychoanalysis does not even believe such states are possible. But the Eastern thought not only believes these states are possible, rather these are the goal states of the spiritual schools. So the limits of human potential are seen very differently by the Eastern thought and by psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is very conservative. The Eastern thought is far more adventurous and liberal. So the question here is it possible to enter into this state of no thought? And what prevents us from entering into this state of no thought? Obviously, psychoanalysis has no answers to any of them, because psychoanalysis does not believe that a state of no thought can be sustained, or freedom from desire can be obtained. even if we divide desire into the biological and the psychological, even freedom from psychological desire in that context of division is not possible from a psychoanalytic standpoint. Question here is, why does cessation of psychic activities not happen in ordinary individuals? Why is it such a rare phenomenon? And the answer is, it is the desire, and related to desire, the fear. Unless these two are thoroughly worked out and exhausted, it is not possible to have cessation of psychic activities. The desire will generate thoughts, will generate fear, will generate anticipation, and that will not allow the cessation of psychic activities to happen. So this goal can be achieved rarely, but even when it is attained rarely, it is attained only after years of working through on desire and fear. So we see the first difference comes up in a paradigmatic way between psychoanalysis and Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. Yoga Sutra of Patanjali not only believes the state of enlightenment, cessation of psychic activities is possible. Of course, he's talking about the conscious part of it, not the unconscious part of it. Especially that unconscious part which is dealing with the biological activities. Although some yoga sages have gone to the extent of including the whole of the unconscious into this cessation, this purview, the scope of this word cessation. And one extreme group of yogis include even the biological part of the mind. Not only that, the whole of biology in this, in the extent of the reach and the stretch of the word cessation. So the expanse of the word cessation is different. The safest interpretation is to say the scope of the word cessation is the scope of the conscious mind. More aggressive interpretation is to expand the word cessation to include the unconscious mind. And even more controversial and bold and even more rare is including the entire body-mind system under the scope of the word cessation. So then it becomes cessation of not all psychic activities, but all psychobiological activities. And that is the state of suspended animation into which some yogis claim they can go into on demand. I had met one person who narrated me this experience of his, and I believe that person was saying the truth. I have no reason to doubt it, although it's a rare experience. He told me that he used to go to Himalayas every summer vacation. He was a professor in a college, so in summer vacations he would go to Himalayas to be trained with this guru. And he did it for quite some long time, 25 years. And in some of those experiences, he was given some herbal ingestion. I'm not sure whether it was a solid or a concoction or tablet. I'm not sure how it was, but he was given some herbal ingestion, and that led him to a state of suspended animation in which not only the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, but the whole of the body entered into this cessation. So the word cessation, the expanse of the word cessation is in three different groups in the Indian yogic context. The common and the safest is to limit it to the conscious mind. So the safest interpretation of this is to say enlightenment or yoga or union is the state, the goal where the cessation of all psychic activities, and the cessation cannot happen unless desire and fear are thoroughly worked through. And this working through may involve only sadhana, and if the desires and fears are very sticky, then only sadhana may not work, experience may be necessary. So the very sticky, very difficult to overcome things, you need real life experience to overcome them. And this real life experience is done with great amount of sincerity and awareness and an intent that one is entering into the experience to be free from this experience or certain elements involved in the experience. If this intent and awareness and sincerity is not there, the experience can easily lead to an addiction. So experience can free us from that experience. Experience can get us into the addiction of that experience. Depends upon the sincerity, intent, and awareness with which one enters into experience. In the Western tradition, not in psychoanalysis, in psychoanalysis, the nearest to this state is the state of oceanic oneness. In the state of oceanic oneness, which Freud talks about as the state of primary narcissism, there is a state of bliss without any object, any thought. Freud does not talk about no thought, but he does talk about no object. It's a pre-I not I state. And that is the closest we get to this. And this is where the mistake happens, that the state of enlightenment, which is a post-maturity state, is confused with the pre-maturity state of oceanic oneness. Because Freud's oceanic oneness is essentially a pre-object state. It is not a post-object state, but this yoga is a post-object state. So the normal developmental process would be to be in a pre-object state, enter into the object relation state, and then enter into a post-object state. So because the object relation school does not admit of any post-object or pre-object state, it's very difficult to bring in object relations into this state. But Freud's idea of primary narcissism is the nearest to it. In Jungian terms, this would be like transcending all the archetypes themselves and having an experience of the self. But this is only in a metaphorical sense, not in a structural sense. If we look at it from a structural point of view, it's very difficult to reconcile this state with Jung's model of the mind. But from a distance, in a very rough and inexact way, we could put this state to say it is transcending of all archetypes. The transcendent function not only moves towards individuation, but the scope of individuation is so expanded that you transcend the archetypal structure itself. and you experience a oneness which cannot be explained in terms of Jung's model of the mind. The only way you can go, even in a distorted way, is to say it can be an experience of the self. But actually, Jung's model of the mind is not geared to explaining this phenomena. In fact, no model of the mind in psychoanalysis is geared towards this. Because of what we said, the limits of human potential are very different in psychoanalysis and in Yoga Sutras. There is also an important element here, which we'll see when we see types of states of enlightenment, types of samadhi. So yoga word here is used as a synonym of enlightenment or synonym of samadhi. So yoga, he says, or samadhi, he says, is cessation of all psychic activities. 1.3 expands on 1.2. It says, it is that then that one resides in its essential form. It's not its, it is one's essential form. When there is a cessation of all psychic activities, then one resides in one's essential form. This creates a question of what is one's essential form. So we then look at the essential self, the authentic self, and the ordinary psychological self. It's a very different way of looking at the personality. So we have the persona, we have the authentic self, and we have the essential self. One deeper layer is added. This, when the activities of the mind cease, one resides in one's essential form. So in psychoanalysis, it's difficult to say how we can put any model of the mind of any school to explain this because of what we said, a paradigmatic difference. This state itself is not accepted as a possible state. So the question of theorizing further on it does not arise. Yoga Sutra talks about it is then that one resides in one's essential form. So here one refers to the goal state structure of oneself. That when you reach the state of enlightenment, you are in your essential form. So the purest form, having dropped off all the accumulations. And by accumulations, we mean not only the material, but also the psychological accumulations. And here, the word one is a controversial word. You can use the word awareness, you can use the word consciousness, or you can use the word one in order to avoid the inaccurate precision which comes when you use the word awareness or consciousness. Instead of it, it is better to use this metaphorical pronoun kind of word, one. It is then that one resides in one's essential form. 1.4 talks about what happens if this state is not achieved, which is true for all of us. We are not in this state. And because we are not in this state of or no thought, we are not residing in our essential form. So how do we describe our own state? The ordinary state of you and me, because you and me are not in this state of no thought, and therefore you and me don't reside in our essential form. So how do we describe our state? So he says, if you are not in these states, one is lost in engagement with objects of consciousness. Or in other words, some people translate it to say, consciousness takes the form of objects. But meaningful, that is more verbal translation of this, but meaning wise, I find this better, that when one is not in a state of no thought, one is lost in engagement with objects of consciousness. If you drop these objects, you enter into a state of pure consciousness and you go back to this state. But usually, we are always in engagement with objects of consciousness. And the word consciousness here is not awareness. It is used in the broader sense, the way Sri Aurobindo defines consciousness. The way the Vedic literature defines consciousness. Awareness is only one aspect of consciousness. We are aware of that aspect in our experiential life. That does not mean other aspects of consciousness are not there. So what is available for experience to us is not the only aspect of that entity. So when we are not in this state, we are lost in the objects of consciousness. And this is where psychoanalysis can easily be brought in, because now we are talking the language of object relations. That this is the ordinary state of all human beings, except for a few who are here, rare ones. But usually, our consciousness is lost in engagement with objects of consciousness. And that is true of not only object relations, but also Freud after the state of primary narcissism. It's all, although Freud does not use that language, but it's all object relations. Like we don't say object relations, object engagement. Once the consciousness is lost in engagement with objects of consciousness, 1.5 talks about the fact that these ceaseless psychic activities, of being in engagement with objects, all these psychic activities can be divided into 5 types. And these psychic activities can either be simple or complex. They can be pleasant or unpleasant. So this engagement with objects, either in the outer world or in the inner world, this engagement with objects which is a ceaseless psychic activity for you and me. This engagement with the objects, the normal run of the mind, so to say, this normal run of the mind, so to speak, is of 5 types. There are 5 categories of engagements or activities of the mind or consciousness that we can talk about. He talks about these 5 types in the later sutra, but what he says is this ceaseless psychic activity is one, it's compulsive in nature. It is not in our hand to control it fully. We can change the subject, we may differ it, but in a fundamental sense, we cannot get into a state of no thought. We can change the subject of thought, we can change the intensity of thought, we can defer thought, we can prepone thought. We cannot be free of thought, cannot be free of affect. So this freedom from thought and affect, because it is not there for ordinary people like you and me, he says in 1.5 that the ceaseless psychic activity is compulsive in nature and can be divided into 5 types. What these types are, I will specify later. But he says in general, all these psychic activities can be pleasant or unpleasant. So it says it can involve pleasure or pain. They can be simple or complex. And we see in psychoanalysis, I mean, there's nothing to contradict here. Psychic activity can be simple or complex. It inevitably involves either pleasure or pain. So this is completely in consonance with psychoanalysis. The 5 types typology is something different, but this principle that psychic activity can be simple or complex, always involving pleasure or pain, it's a very consensus thing between Yoga Sutras and psychoanalysis. In 1.6, he details out what he said in 1.5. In 1.5, he said there are 5 categories of psychic activities. And here he details them out. First, the psychic activity can lead to correct knowledge. It can involve correct knowledge, wrong knowledge, imagination, sleep, or memory. So these are the 5 broad categories of psychic knowledge that he delineates. That the psychic knowledge may involve correct knowledge, psychic activity may involve or lead to wrong knowledge, it can involve imagination, it can involve sleep, or it can involve memory. So conscious correct thinking, conscious wrong thinking, imagination, psychic activity in sleep, and psychic activity from memory. And of course, when you say correct knowledge and correct wrong knowledge and imagination, you have to add to it affect. It does not talk about affect. So he is talking here more from a logician's point of view, and therefore it is more cognitive in nature. And of course, the affect part is not covered here. The transformative part is also not covered here. Transformative part will come later, but the affect part remains uncovered. So he talks about the 5 broad categories of psychic activities, and one classification he arrives at is psychic activities involving or leading to correct knowledge, leading to wrong knowledge, involving imagination, involving sleep, and involving memory. And then in 1.7 he details out further what is correct knowledge. So he's detailing out one by one, narrowing down the focus, detailing out phrases and words and concepts that he is using. So first he said there is ceaseless psychic activity. Then he said the ceaseless psychic activity can be divided into 5 categories. Then he takes up one category each and details out one category each. So he says the first one, correct knowledge. He says true knowledge is based on foundation of direct knowing, correct inference from that which is known, or credible testimony of somebody that you can trust. And this also involves a deeper question of logic. What is the criteria of truth? And in the Indian tradition, contrary to the Western tradition, the criteria of truth definitely involves empirical knowing. It involves direct experiential knowing. It involves deductive knowing by inference. But this is something different. This is not true for the Western thinking. The credible testimony of somebody that who is credible, and this is more true in the psychophilosophical area, that one who has undergone rare experiences of enlightenment, when he says something, his testimony is taken as credible, even if what he says is neither your direct knowledge nor an inference of direct knowledge. And this credible testimony at times is put to test, at times it cannot be tested. It is just believed in, involving an element of faith. So the criteria of truth are different in the Eastern and the Western tradition. In the Eastern tradition, the credible testimony of the sages and the rishis who have experienced rare states of consciousness after years of self-work, their testimony also is one of the criteria of truth. Similarly, what is written in the Smritis is also a criteria of truth. By Smritis, we mean Shrutis. By Shrutis, we mean the Vedas and the Upanishads. In psychoanalysis, we don't use this criteria of credible testimony. It's a more republican context. Other forms of knowledge we definitely use in psychoanalysis, all the criteria and the knowledge. Then he defines false knowledge. False knowledge is based on misjudgment. It can be misjudgment of direct experience, misjudgment of deduction, or a logical fallacy if there is a long deduction and derivation process, and in between a false logical fallacy seeps in. And that is where, from psychoanalytic point of view, we would look at unconscious motivations, why that logical fallacy has slipped in. He then defines in 1.9 imagination. Says imagination is psychic activity of experiencing an alternative to consensus concrete reality. That we all have a consensus on what is a real objective concrete reality, and something apart from it, we term it as imagination. So he's defining the 5 categories of psychic activities. And of course, this is the forte of psychoanalysis, the world of fantasy. Both fantasy with F and fantasy with PH. This is also an area where it becomes too much, we get into psychosis, where the person creates his own reality completely apart from the consensus concrete reality which we all agree to. Sutra 1.10 comes to the fourth element of psychic domain, sleep, and he says it is psychic state devoid of waking awareness, founded on inertia and non-being of the waking ego. These are my translations, and I am not very well versed in the deeper aspects of Sanskrit, so they all stand to be corrected. But from meaning point of view, they are good enough, not from the etymological point of view. From meaning standpoint, in the context of our discussion, they are good enough. And these are essentially launch pads. We start off from there and get into discussions. Sleep is a psychic state devoid of waking awareness, yes, founded on inertia and non-being of the waking ego. At the same time, it's a very interesting part of experience for psychoanalysis because it involves dreams, and dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. So Patanjali does not refer to dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. He also does not go into uh, detailed explanation of the unconscious in a structural sense. He goes into the generic macro engagement with the unconscious, but he does not go into a fine structured deconstruction or functional description of the unconscious. Psychoanalysis does it better in terms of finer structural or functional description of the unconscious. The difference being the unconscious talked about in the Eastern tradition, including Yoga Sutras, is the unconscious of many lives. The unconscious in the Yoga Sutras and the Eastern tradition, the unconscious is transpersonal in the sense it involves material from past lives. In distinction to the psychoanalytic unconscious, which is confined to this life only. And this again has a paradigmatic difference point that psychoanalysis does not go into reincarnation, whereas reincarnation is one of the fundamental beliefs of in the Indian tradition and also continues in the Yoga Sutra. In fact, Patanjali talks about self-development process not only for human beings but for beings who don't have a body, which means after the soul and the personality have left the body. And I was just imagining with humor, how would it be if disembodied beings came for psychotherapy and lying down on the couch? So there is a complete paradigmatic difference between psychoanalysis and Yoga Sutra on this point of reincarnation. Coming to 1.10, there are 3 points which are important. One, it is a state devoid of waking awareness, but it is still a conscious state because activities of thinking, dreaming, affect are all going on. So awareness is not synonymous with consciousness. It is one expression of consciousness. Second, we get into the state of inertia. We touch the state of inertia as safely as we can touch it. Freud's source of the death instinct. And there is non-being, absence of the waking ego. The ego is not completely absent, it is working, but it is not of the form of the waking ego. There is ego unconsciously working, using defenses, doing dream work. The dream work happens using all the defenses. So the ego in the unconscious is still operating, but the waking ego is no longer there. So the part of the ego, which is the waking ego, is no longer there. One way to look at it is to differentiate the ego between the system ego or the unconscious ego and the social personality or the social ego. So I define it as, I differentiate the ego into the social ego and the unconscious ego. So this is a new kind of a classification into a waking ego and ego in sleep, a sleeping ego, or let me say ego in sleep, not a sleeping ego, but an ego in sleep. That classification also can be explored. I prefer the social ego and the system ego to constitute the whole of the ego. So we have started off today with first 10 sutras. As we enter deeper, we get into more substantial discussions, drawing parallels, contradictions, mutual enrichment, synthesis, opening up new spaces. It's taken about I think one hour, something more than 1 hour for 10 sutras. So we can take up, I think, 15 or 20 sutras per day, 2 or 3 sessions of 1 hour each, or 3 sessions of 40 minutes each, and in 3 months' time we should be able to complete it. Thank you.